The ground was not earth, but black, smoking grit. Volcanic sand, hot beneath the cleats of their boots, shifted constantly, swallowing every attempt they made to dig in. Chief Carpenter's mate, Fred Farina, felt the familiar vibration of incoming mortar fire, the distant whump followed by the frantic, descending whistle. He did not flinch, keeping the shovel blade down, desperately trying to scoop the loose material back into the crater that had just swallowed a half-track vehicle. Shrapnel, a wind-torn scream of metal, whizzed just overhead. His entrenching shovel, the one he swore he would varnish and take home, stopped a piece that struck his back, delivering a dull, heavy thump instead of a lethal tear. The wind here smelled of sulfur and cordite, truly cutting like glass as it drove volcanic grit into their eyes. They were racing the clock and racing the enemy to finish laying down this patch of crucial Marston matting. They heard the laboured, dying engine sounds now. A crippled superfortress, a B-29, was attempting a blind emergency landing. If these builders did not turn this hellish spongy muck into a runway immediately, 11 men would die. This was Iwo Jima in February of 1945, and here construction was survival.
But how did a force of builders end up fighting for their lives in volcanic ash?
The answer lay 3 years and thousands of miles away, in the smouldering ruins of a Hawaiian naval base. December 7, 1941, was more than just a military defeat. It was a logistical catastrophe that revealed a terrifying vulnerability. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, followed by rapid Japanese expansion across the Pacific, meant America had nowhere to land. America needed forward bases, airfields, supply depots, and fuel farms to project power and secure the lifeline of the Pacific. But the traditional civilian contractors who built America could not be deployed to the forward zones of war. They were non-combatants, unarmed, and utterly incapable of defending themselves or their crews against hostile forces. The practical flaw was glaring. The military needed builders, but those builders absolutely had to be soldiers. Into this void stepped Admiral Ben Muriel, chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, who would soon be known throughout the fleet as the King Bee. Muriel, an engineer himself, recognized that this war would be won by logistics just as much as by brute firepower. He proposed an unprecedented solution: recruit America's most skilled civilian tradesmen, the steel workers, the carpenters, the plumbers, the tractor operators, and put every single one of them in uniform. He was not looking for raw recruits. He was looking for the men who, as one newspaperman later quoted by Morel described, can build tank traps with sticks of macaroni. He wanted men who could repair a lady's wristwatch with a Stilson wrench or pitch hay with a one-prong fork. The establishment of the Naval Construction Battalions, the Seabees, on January 5, 1942, formalized this monumental shift. Experienced construction personnel were offered commissions, and skilled tradesmen enlisted en masse. They were men recruited straight from firms and unions, now soldiers, immediately imbued with the emerging can-do spirit. Their initial training grounds, like Quonset Point and Port Hueneme, quickly became cauldrons of dual instruction. They learned how to operate a bulldozer, and they learned how to operate a rifle. By March of 1942, their unofficial motto, "Can Do," was made official, coupled with the iconic insignia of a furious fighting bee. By that summer, 9 battalions were active, serving everywhere from the South Pacific to Alaska and even Iceland. Their first major test came quickly. The Bobcat Detachment, led by Lieutenant Commander Harold McTavish Sylvester, was dispatched over 2,000 miles from Hawaii to the remote island of Bora Bora. They arrived to a scene of brilliant blue water and idyllic green peaks, which swiftly dissolved into a grueling green nightmare. Sylvester's men, initially described by one observer as smelling like goats, living like dogs, and working like horses, faced a monumental task with criminally inadequate supplies. The logistical failures were immediate and absurd. Wheelbarrows arrived without wheels. Trucks were often the wrong type, and they desperately lacked spare parts. They struggled for essentials like nails, welding masks, and even screens for the Quonset huts they were supposed to be erecting. The army trucks they did have quickly pulverized the island's fragile roads into a sea of mud. With the pier misplaced, the Bobcats were forced to unload vital cargo completely by hand. The physical effort was staggering, perhaps best illustrated by the sheer impossibility of manually moving 8 13-ton gun barrels, along with their breech blocks and mounts, to their emplacements. This required immense physical labor, even though the island never faced a sea attack. Despite the chaos, The Bobcats erected 400 Quonset huts within 3 weeks, built 8 galleys, and laid 13 miles of pipeline while constantly struggling to find fresh water. The early challenges did not break them, they forged them. They learned quickly that if the official supply chain failed, they had to invent their own. This resourceful acquisition, known in Navy parlance as cumshaw, became the enduring hallmark of the construction battalions. They learned to fashion engine gaskets from empty oil drums and used Coca-Cola bottles as electrical insulators. They pieced together power systems from equipment salvaged from 9 different countries, running Swiss engines alongside captured Japanese generators. They were the ultimate improvisers, the men who turned scarcely more than a wide spot in the coral reef into vital strategic assets. They were ready for the next phase of the war, where ingenuity would be tested not just by bureaucracy and mud, but by the weight of Japanese steel in the Solomons. This rapid transformation from civilian contractor to combat-ready engineer was a crucible of adaptation and violence, played out across the vast hostile Pacific. While the Bobcats were battling mud and misplaced nails in Bora Bora, the next wave of construction battalions was hurtling toward the true front lines. The construction zone here was enemy territory. The strategic imperative was clear: Guadalcanal. After the Marines' brutal struggle to secure a beachhead and the captured Japanese airfield, renamed Henderson Field, the immediate challenge was simply keeping it operational. The field, initially a slippery, spongy muck strip barely 3/4 of a mile long, was essential, but it was a magnet for Japanese artillery and bombers. In the late summer of 1942, a new construction battalion arrived. They were tasked with turning a pure mud hole into an all-weather field capable of handling the continuous traffic of the Cactus Air Force. The work was relentless, defined by the constant, bone-jarring texture of mud and the humid air thick with the smell of wet earth and diesel. The engineers had to haul clay, stone, and coral, building up the center of the strip for drainage and replacing the saturated soil with fresh layers of gravel and crushed coral. Lieutenant Commander Paul Blunden, arriving on a PBY flying only 100 feet or so above the water due to the ever-present threat of Zero attacks, watched his men work with an almost terrifying efficiency. He calculated that one Seabee operating a 12-cubic-yard carryall, their mechanical advantage was undeniable, but speed did not negate the danger. The Japanese responded with methodical, nightly harassment. Shelling from unseen artillery pieces, instantly dubbed Pistol Pete, would often start just as the sun set. Then came the bombers' washing machine Willie and Louis the Louse, dropping their payloads with grim regularity. One evening, the engineers were laying Marston matting, those interlocking sheets of perforated steel, when the air raid siren wailed. The matting, usually a symbol of progress, suddenly became a hazard, the wet steel slick underfoot. Seaman Second Class Lawrence Bucky Meyer, a young man who had quickly mastered the dual roles of builder and fighter, dropped his tools and sprinted for his post. Though the Seabees had built sturdy foxholes covered with coconut logs and dirt, when the enemy was actively tearing the ground apart, any kind of hole offered protection enough. This particular attack was heavy, with 30 twin-engine planes hammering the field. Meyer found himself at a machine gun emplacement, tracers spitting into the humid night sky. The ground shook violently as a daisy-cutter bomb struck nearby, designed to explode just above the surface to maximize shrapnel spread. Razor-sharp metal tore through the air in a terrifying 50-foot circle, killing 11 Marines who were sheltering in a shallow gravel pit nearby. Meyer kept firing, the smell of burning aviation fuel mixing with cordite in his nostrils. Through the smoke, he tracked a Japanese Zero making a low pass. He held the trigger down until the plane shuddered, streamed smoke, and plunged into the jungle below. Meyer had shot down the Zero, an action that would later earn him the Silver Star. The Japanese counterattack pushed the Marine lines perilously close, sometimes within 150 feet of the vital runway. On October 13th, the bombing intensified into a catastrophe. The field was torn up, the mast and matting ripped and twisted into useless wreckage. The Seabees worked feverishly to repair it, their construction equipment momentarily silenced by the overwhelming need for immediate repair. Shipfitters First Class Howard Osborne and Duncan Gillis were working near the edge of the runway when a brutal 14-inch naval shell slammed into the ground. The blast buried several comrades under tons of coral and gravel. Time stopped for the 2 shipfitters. They didn't wait for orders or for heavy equipment. They grabbed whatever was at hand, helmets, scrap wood, or just their bare hands, and started digging. The air was thick with choking dust and the ringing sound of their own frantic effort. They were not combat engineers in the traditional sense, but the immediate crisis demanded direct, brutal action. They clawed through the debris, pulling out the trapped men, saving them from suffocation, all while the unseen menace they called Pistol Pete continued its harassment. Both men earned silver stars for their heroism. For 48 grueling hours, 53 holes marred Henderson Field. Yet, incredibly, the field was closed to bombers for only 4 hours during the worst of the attacks. Commander Blunden proudly noted that 100 Seabees could completely repair the damage of a 500-pound bomb hit in only 40 minutes. They were fighting a war of attrition against damage, and they were winning. The Seabees' ingenuity wasn't confined to sheer labor. When they discovered a shortage of hand shovels, they adapted, using their steel helmets to scoop coral and gravel. When they needed to cut the mast and matting efficiently, they took a V8 motor and hydraulic pump, salvaged from wrecked equipment, and built a mechanical cutter. They even fashioned a plow from wrecked tank armor plate. They repaired a captured Japanese power plant and, with a pile driver fashioned from Japanese steel, built a timber pier and a bridge, dubbed the Mami-Yokum Bridge. The result was a profound shift in the logistical landscape. One construction battalion set a record for mast and mat laid in a single day. Another constructed a 1 1/4 mile railroad in just 3 days. They achieved a mechanical speed and tactical efficiency that Major General Vandergrift, the Marine commander, later admitted was indispensable. He stated plainly that he did not know how they would have gotten along without the Seabees. Guadalcanal was the proving ground. It solidified the Seabees' dual identity. They were builders, yes, but they were also fighters, men capable of moving mountains of earth while staring down incoming fire. They had transformed a jungle island into a forward operating base. Now, the lessons of speed and ingenuity were about to be applied to the next, even more audacious phase of the Pacific advance. They were ready for the next move, one which would impress even the hard-charging Admiral William F. Halsey. The victory at Guadalcanal proved the United States could hold ground, but the Pacific conflict was fundamentally a war of distance and speed. To advance further, the Allied forces needed air cover, and they needed it immediately. The Seabees had shown they could repair a field under fire, but now they had to prove they could conjure a complete base out of pure jungle faster than the Japanese could mobilize a defense. This new race against time led them deep into the Solomons campaign, a labyrinth of islands where the enemy still held significant ground. The next critical objective was Segi Point on New Georgia. The ultimate strategic goal was to neutralize the major Japanese airfield at Munda, but first, the advancing Marines needed fighter cover. Segi Point was the staging ground, a place where a new airstrip had to materialize overnight. On June 30th, 1943, the 47th Construction Battalion arrived. They were deployed after a meticulous, tense reconnaissance mission led by Lieutenant Bob Ryan, a 49-year-old California engineer and veteran of the First World War. Ryan and a detachment of Seabees, along with Marine officers, had played a dangerous game of hide-and-go-seek with the Japanese army in the days prior. After a clandestine night departure from Russell Island, Ryan's group landed near the shore, guided by local natives who warned them of patrols and led them to safe campsites. The tension was palpable. Every rustle in the jungle, every snap of a branch, made the soldiers check their rifles, finding it hard to hold their fire. The construction site itself was a nightmare of mud and dense vegetation. The 47th Battalion faced 14 inches of relentless rain almost immediately upon arrival. The ground was saturated, the heavy machinery sinking into the muck. But the men had the mechanical advantage, and the can-do spirit forged first at Bora Bora and then hardened at Guadalcanal. They were using the lessons learned: move fast, improvise everything, and never stop digging. The air was humid, smelling of decay, diesel fumes, and the constant stinging spray of mud thrown up by the heavy equipment.
The Seabees worked 24 hours a day, the sound of bulldozers and carryalls creating an industrial roar that defied the jungle quiet.
They blasted coral, dragged logs, and laid down the base for the runway, all while knowing they were operating under the constant threat of Japanese bombers attempting to wipe out the nascent base before it could become functional. 9 days after the first Seabee boot hit the beach, the impossible happened. A single plane, an observation aircraft, touched down gingerly on the rapidly constructed strip. The sound of the landing gear hitting the coral was a victory cry. By the 11th day, the field was fully operational, and American fighter planes were roaring off the newly laid surface. They provided the critical air superiority needed to support the impending attacks on Munda. The speed of the construction was so audacious it became legendary almost instantly. Admiral William F. H. Halsey, the notoriously hard-charging commander of the South Pacific Forces, heard the reports and refused to believe them. He flew directly to Segi Point to see the miracle for himself. Admiral Halsey stepped out of his plane and was immediately confronted by the full, unbridled pace of the Construction Battalion. The ground was still vibrating from the heavy machinery, the air thick with the dust of crushed coral and the fierce shouts of the foreman. The Admiral, known for his relentless energy, found himself physically struggling to keep pace with the construction teams who were moving earth and equipment with brutal efficiency. Halsey later recounted the experience, offering a powerful testament to the Seabees' furious, non-stop effort. He remarked that he had to run most of the time just to keep from being shoveled into the ocean. Segi Point proved conclusively that the Seabees were the true engine of the amphibious express across the Pacific theatre. They were not merely building bases, they were actively compressing the timeline of the war itself. These engineers understood the terrain intimately, having mastered the unique characteristics of the Pacific Islands. They knew the hard, scratchy coral that shredded equipment, the soft volcanic sand, and the deep, inescapable mud of others. Their famous resourcefulness was no longer just a good story. It was a military necessity, fashioning mufflers from worn-out bazookas and cutting shoe soles from old truck tires. But the lessons of the Solomons paved the way for the next great challenge. This required not just speed, but a massive coordinated engineering effort on a scale never before attempted, the creation of floating infrastructure to enable the invasion of Europe. The Pacific Theatre had taught them how to build on the water, leading directly to one of the greatest technical innovations of the entire war, pontoon technology. It was Captain John Laycock who developed the system of heavy steel sections that could be rapidly assembled into causeways, floating piers, and barges of varying capacities. These versatile pontoons, propelled by large outboard motors, were the ultimate expression of the can-do spirit. They transformed into icebreakers, floating cranes, and through liberal application of cumshore, even ice cream freezers and showers. The need for rapid deployment also led to the creation of the telescoping causeway. Designed to be transported on the sides of landing ships' tank, they could be extended like a fireman's ladder. The testing ground for this new innovation was the invasion of Sicily. During the chaotic landing, these causeways, only 2 pontoons wide and 170 to 5 feet long, were deployed in approximately 30 minutes. They stretched across the shallow waters, allowing tanks and trucks to land safely where the larger ships could not reach. The invasion was a maelstrom of fire and water, but the deployment by the engineers was seamless. The danger was immediate and indiscriminate. Amidst the landing chaos, a flaming landing ship, tank, loaded with gasoline and ammunition, was struck. The heat was searing, and the threat of a massive secondary explosion was imminent. 4 Seabees and 1 Army man plunged into the fray. Chief Carpenter's mate Albert Unkenholtz, without hesitation, dove straight into the burning oil slick surrounding the ship. He tied a line to a soldier who had been blown overboard. Together, they rescued 90 men from the inferno. The Seabees were no longer just the men who paved the way. They were the men who secured the beachhead, often operating dangerously close to the front lines. One outfit even found itself 700 feet ahead of the actual fighting. At Peleliu, they waded into the sea to defuse detonators from floating mines before the assault waves even landed. Their informal nature and blunt determination were captured perfectly when a sentry, confronted by an admiral asking if he was in charge, simply replied, "Well, it's a pretty good job, bub. Don't louse it up." The stage was set. The Seabees had proven their mettle in the jungle mud of the Pacific. Now, they were bringing their ingenuity to the greatest amphibious operation in history, Operation Overlord. They would attempt to build a harbour where none existed, battling the brutal currents of the English Channel and the concrete defences of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The logistical machine that propelled the Allied advance across the Pacific was built on ingenuity forged in mud and fire. But the greatest test of the Seabees' capacity to overcome geography came not in the jungle, but in the cold, unforgiving waters of the English Channel. The invasion of Europe, Operation Overlord, faced a challenge far greater than the defending enemy: the critical lack of a suitable natural harbour along the Normandy coast. The flat beach gradient, the treacherous sandbars, and the immense tidal range meant that even if the assault succeeded, the massive volume of men, tanks, and material needed to sustain the fight would quickly choke the landing zones. The solution demanded a feat of engineering audacity: the artificial harbours known as the mulberries and the gooseberries. The scale of the project was staggering. It involved the construction of the phoenixes, massive concrete floats, some as tall as a 5-story building. These were designed to be towed across the channel and deliberately sunk to form the harbour's outer breakwaters. Several construction battalions, alongside specialised detachments, were deeply involved in the final preparations and deployment. The plan required the assembly of 22,806 pontoons. That was enough steel to build a causeway 14 feet wide and 10 miles long, connecting the breakwaters to the shore. These pontoons would support whale bridges and blister platforms, creating stable unloading docks that extended far beyond the low tide mark. But the most immediate and critical gap the Seabees had to bridge was the final step from ship to shore. They needed a vehicle that could effectively marry the mammoth landing ships, tank, in deep water. This vehicle had to ferry half their cargo directly onto the contested beaches. The answer was the Rhino ferry. To the naval aviators who first saw them from the air, the pontoon barges looked exactly like their namesake. They were huge, lumbering beasts wallowing in the bay. Their 2 large outboard motors stuck up like an animal's haunches, and the low bow resembled a rhino's nose with its ugly horn. 81 of these crucial rhinos were built and deployed for Operation Overlord. On D1, the Seabee crews, including Seaman George Tyle, began the perilous tow across the English Channel. The weather, famously, had obviously not read the operation order. The channel swells quickly exceeded twice the designed operating capacity of the heavy barges. The rhinos, heavy and awkward, rolled and pitched violently. Seasickness ravaged the crews, many of whom were combat engineers, not career sailors accustomed to open water. Tyle was on one of the towing vessels when the officers in charge became incapacitated by the relentless motion. Without hesitation, the young Seabee took command of the Navy vessel. His cool and decisive action maneuvering the tow string through the churning water ensured the vital equipment made it to the assembly areas off the French coast. D-Day, June 6, 1940-4. 11 rhinos were in the first assault wave at Omaha Beach. The process of loading the vehicles from the landing ship's tank onto the rolling, swaying barges was agonizingly slow, often taking close to 2 hours. The seas were still rough, and the air was thick with the sound of naval gunfire and the distant rattle of machine guns. Lieutenant Robert Stilgenbauer was maneuvering Rhino Ferry No. 10 toward the designated landing zone at Omaha Beach around noon. The water was a chaotic mix of floating debris, burning oil, and wrecked landing craft. Stilgenbauer could clearly see the concrete and steel obstacles anchored in the surf, the deadly tetrahedrons and hedgehogs, many still concealing mines. He navigated his ferry carefully between the narrow gaps cleared by the demolition teams. The landing itself was successful. The ramp dropped, and the vehicles began to roll onto the sand. But the tide was dropping fast. Lieutenant Stilgenbauer successfully unloaded his vital cargo, but when he tried to retract the massive Rhino ferry, he found himself instantly stranded. Uncleared German mines prevented him from pulling back into deeper water. The Rhino was stuck, a massive, tempting target sitting low on the sand. The beach clearing was arduous, slower than planned, and it took until the afternoon of D+1 for Omaha to be cleared sufficiently for all the ferries to operate safely. At Utah Beach, the Seabee effort was slightly smoother. 4 ferries were ashore by midnight on D-Day, and by the end of D+1, 11 rhinos had made 16 trips, landing approximately 650 vehicles. But the fight was far from over. On D+1, ferry No. 6 at Omaha was struck by shrapnel, wounding its officer. Chief Electrician's mate Robert M. Miller, a man who would later admit his instinct during air raids was to crawl completely into one small helmet, immediately took command of the reduced crew. Despite the constant threat of incoming fire and the grim evidence of the previous day's slaughter surrounding them, Miller kept the ferry operational. He demonstrated the Seabees' unique ability to pivot instantly from builder to combat leader under extreme duress. The Seabees' role in Normandy was the critical link in the logistical chain. They were the men who built the harbours that sustained the entire invasion. They were the ones who, facing the gale of June 19th that battered the newly sunk Phoenix breakwaters with waves as tall as a two-story building, immediately set to work restoring order. Their efforts ensured the prolonged flow of fuel, ammunition, and men. This logistical revolution from the individual, hand-dug foxholes of Guadalcanal to the massive engineered floating harbours of Normandy proved that the Seabees were the indispensable builders of Allied victory. They were transforming the impossible geography of war into a highway for victory. They were the unsung heroes of the steam shovel and the monkey wrench, ensuring that while the soldiers fought, the supply line would never break. The success of the Normandy landings and the subsequent breakout demonstrated the sheer, overwhelming power of American logistics, a power engineered by the Seabees. But even as the war ground through the hedgerows of France, the ultimate strategic victory was being secured thousands of miles away, on small, fiercely defended islands in the Western Pacific. The goal was to bring the Japanese mainland within range of the massive B-29 superfortress bombers. That required turning tiny specks of coral and volcanic sand into the world's largest air bases. Tinian, in the Mariana Islands, was the next critical step. Its capture was necessary, but its transformation was monumental. 15,000 Seabees descended upon the island, tasked with moving 11 million cubic yards of earth and coral. They needed to construct 6 massive bomber strips, each one approximately 1.5 miles long and a block wide, along with 11 miles of taxiways and hard stands. These facilities had to be capable of supporting nearly 300 planes at North Field. They were building what would become the world's largest air base, paving enough blacktop to stretch from Boston to the White House. The work was 20 hours a day, fueled by exhaustion and the desperate need to finish. The coral, hard and scratchy, got into everything, wearing out equipment and skin alike. Yet the Seabees' resourcefulness reached a legendary peak here. They were come-shore artists of the highest order, using Japanese tank armor for shovel teeth, worn-out bazookas for mufflers, and devising wire cable loops on axles to prevent coral damage. They even cut shoe soles from truck tires. Every day, 12 tons of dynamite blasted through the coral deposits, followed by 95 drill rigs preparing the ground. The fills were compacted in layers by sheep's-foot rollers, their cleats leaving footprints of a herd of sheep. The coral was tamped to precise 6 to 9-inch depths. Then crowned with 18 to 24 inches of coral, precision was paramount. Elevation controls ensured a mere 1-foot variation per 100 feet of runway. Tinian was not a safe construction zone. Surveyors like Pop Shiner worked under the constant, nerve-wracking threat of hidden Japanese soldiers who had refused to surrender. One surveyor, marking his lines, was suddenly attacked, forced to use his leveling rod as a weapon to deflect a grenade. The tension was so pervasive that even mundane sentry duty was fraught with peril. Seaman Don Brubaker discovered this on Saipan, mistaking a bull for an enemy infiltrator in the darkness. The Japanese had defended Tinian by leveraging its natural defenses, particularly its steep coral cliffs. This problem was overcome by a quintessential Seabee innovation, the Doodlebug scaling ramp, conceived by Civil Engineer Officer Captain Paul Halloran. This ingenious device of steel beams and wooden cross ties was affixed to amphibious LVTs. It functioned like an elephant's tusks or a medieval scaling ladder. It allowed the alligators to surmount the sheer cliffs, facilitating a successful, unexpected landing that dramatically shortened the fight. With Tinian secured and transformed into a launching pad, the Pacific Express hurtled toward its final, bloodiest destination, Okinawa. Okinawa, 350 miles south of Tokyo, was the last crucial stepping stone, the staging ground for the planned invasion of Japan itself. Commodore Andrew G. Bissett led approximately 16,000 Seabees in the assault force. On D-Day, shore parties from the 58th, 71st and 19045 battalions went ashore, clearing mines, widening roads and repairing the captured airfields. Their forward-thinking approach was evident. Seabee surveyors had already laid out the roads and airstrips ahead of the capture, ensuring that once the ground was taken, construction could begin instantly. The first captured airfield was ready for use by D+3. The Japanese had painstakingly broken the thin coral surface by hand. The Seabees replaced it with a 12-inch layer of crushed coral laid by their ubiquitous heavy machinery. The 70th Battalion manned over 25 strings of pontoon causeways, While the 128th Battalion used nearly 100 barges as ferries and ambulances, Okinawa was a grueling green nightmare of heat, humidity, and the constant bone-jarring texture of mud, all under an incessant hail of mortar and gunfire. Yet the Seabees maintained their pride, their determination fueled by the knowledge that their work was bringing the war home to Japan. Admiral Ben Morrell, the King Bee, personally inspected the island, a testament to the scale of the achievement where 95,000 men transformed Okinawa into an airdrome capable of handling 4,000 planes. But the most desperate, visceral test of the Seabee spirit was already underway on a tiny, smoking island of black volcanic ash, Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was sheer, concentrated violence. The Seabees landed just 20 minutes after the initial assault began, their first role not as builders, but as shore parties, hauling supplies and ammunition across the treacherous, loose volcanic sand. This sand was their enemy. Digging a foxhole was a desperate struggle. The sides collapsed almost instantly. Seabees, alongside Marines, had to claw into the treacherous ground for protection. The air was filled with a high, whining scream, the sound of shrapnel, and the pervasive, choking smell of sulfur and cordite. Chief Carpenter's mate Fred Farina, his face grimy with sweat and ash, felt the heavy, dull impact against his back. It was his entrenching shovel that stopped the shrapnel, a piece of twisted metal that would have otherwise torn into his spine. He vowed right there to take that shovel home, varnish it, and put it on his mantle. Nearby, Seaman Frank Riefel miraculously suffered only a scratch when shrapnel knocked the ring right off his finger. The Seabees were building the runway under fire, engaged in a desperate race against the clock and the entrenched enemy. Within 12 days, the Marines had seized all 3 Japanese airfields, but the construction, repair, and extension work never ceased. The construction battalions worked ceaselessly, laying mast and matting from the water's edge and across the jagged black ash. The volcanic ground suddenly shuddered, not from an explosion this time, but from the vibrating roar of heavy machinery. The Seabees could hear the laboured, dying engine sounds now. A crippled superfortress, a massive B-29, was attempting a blind emergency landing. The B-29, looking like a giant wounded bird, banked low over the sulphurous steam vents of the island. Its landing gear was down, but one engine was spitting fire and oily smoke. The pilot, struggling fiercely for control, was aiming for the only clear strip of ground, the one the Seabees were frantically trying to finish. The immediate danger was a massive crater, blasted out by a naval shell earlier that morning, now partially filled with spongy muck. Private Outlaw, a young Seabee who had been scooping sand with his helmet, looked up, sweat and black ash stinging his eyes. The huge plane was too low and coming in too fast. If it hit that hole, the aircraft would cartwheel instantly, destroying the plane and killing the entire crew. "Move the matting," yelled the foreman, his voice rough and raw. Outlaw and 4 other Seabees, ignoring the distant pop of unseen Japanese snipers, threw their weight against the edge of the final section of mast and mat. The perforated steel was heavy, slick with mud, and incredibly awkward. They muscled it forward, dragging it over the lip of the crater they had just tamped down with crushed coral. There was no time for the crane or the bulldozer. This was raw, frantic human labor powered by pure adrenaline. The sound of the B-29's remaining engines became a deafening scream. The air pressure dropped violently as the massive aircraft rushed overhead. The men flattened themselves against the ground, the sound vibrating deep within their bones. The plane's wheels hit the ground with a sickening bam, then skipped once, then twice. The nose wheel slammed down precisely onto the newly laid mast and matting. The matting held fast. The B-29 shuddered violently, its brakes screaming, trailing smoke, but it stayed straight. It slowed, eventually taxiing to a stop near a makeshift refueling depot. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of steam escaping from the volcanic cracks in the runway. 11 men were saved. One vital B-29, a machine essential to the final push against Japan, was saved. The Seabees immediately went back to work, already clearing the sand and debris kicked up by the landing. This was the ultimate victory of the Naval Construction Battalion. They had not won a hill, but they had saved a critical mission through sheer impossible construction speed. The airfields built by the Seabees on Tinian, Guam, and Iwo Jima became the ultimate strategic weapon. The coral they transformed into runways made the final strikes possible. It was from these logistical hubs, constructed under fire and against nature, that the B-29s launched the final strikes against the Japanese mainland. Admiral Halsey later declared that the Seabees were capable of building another island on Iwo Jima. Secretary of the Navy James V. Forrestal was even more direct. He stated that the Seabees had carried the war in the Pacific on their backs, paving the way for the success of every major amphibious invasion. The war ended not with a final infantry charge, but with the deployment of the ultimate weapon from the world's largest airport, a true testament to the ingenuity of the men who could build victory by sweat. The Seabees had done the difficult immediately, and the impossible had only taken them a little longer. The guns fell silent, but the work did not. The end of the war, ushered in by the superfortresses flying from Seabee-built runways, did not mean peace for the naval construction battalions. The immediate post-war period demanded massive infrastructure reconstruction, demobilization, and the maintenance of a vast global network of bases. The Seabees, who had swelled to 258,872 officers and men during the conflict, instantly transitioned from fighting the Japanese to fighting rot, rust, and tropical decay. The King Bee, Admiral Ben Morrell, oversaw the scaling back, yet the can-do spirit had become a permanent, indispensable part of the US Navy. The Seabees found themselves engaged in a different kind of global conflict, the Cold War. Base construction and rapid response were now vital tactical necessities. They built and maintained facilities across the globe, from the Philippines where they ferried Carabao across Subic Bay and moved native villages, all the way to the Mediterranean. The next great test of their adaptability came not in the suffocating humidity of the tropics, but in the sterile, bone-shattering cold of the polar regions. The Seabees had conquered the jungle. Now they faced a war fought against nature itself in its most extreme form. In 1955, Operation Deep Freeze began, launching the Seabees into Antarctica. The men of the specialized Mobile Construction Battalion traded their jungle fatigues for layers of thermal gear. They exchanged the constant threat of biting ants and hooker gorillas for the silent, lethal menace of hypothermia and blinding whiteouts. The goal was to establish permanent scientific bases on the frozen continent, a monumental task. This required them to build structures and airstrips on shifting ice shelves and frozen tundra, environments that actively fought against human intrusion. The sheer violence of the Antarctic climate was a profound shock. They had endured the howling Alaskan wind that was said to drive the snow up your trouser legs and out your collar, but this was different. Temperatures often fell to 65 degrees or more below zero. One thermometer was recorded nosediving to 102 degrees below zero, with an average winter temperature of nearly 75 below. The wind, when it came, didn't just chill, it cut like glass. In January 1957, the Seabees landed at McMurdo Sound. The beachhead they seized was not defended by enemy soldiers, but by a colony of 150,000 Adelie penguins. It was a peculiar battle, the men navigating around the dense, squawking masses of flightless birds while attempting to offload heavy equipment. The most critical, terrifying project was the construction of an airstrip on the Ross Ice Shelf. Chief Petty Officer Aurelio Tassoni, a man who famously declared he was so tough he wasn't born I was quarried, oversaw the initial blasting. The process was agonizingly slow. The deep cold made steel brittle and diesel fuel thick as molasses. Equipment seized up instantly, fingers froze to metal, and visibility often dropped to zero in seconds as blizzards swept across the ice. The enemy here was not mortar fire, but the ceaseless, overwhelming cold. Tassoni remembered the feeling of the ice under his boots, not solid and reassuring, but vast, shifting, and profoundly alive. They drilled into the ice, setting charges to level the surface, but the constant movement of the ice shelf meant their work was always temporary and always tenuous. One afternoon, a whiteout struck with brutal speed. Tassoni was supervising a team attempting to anchor the foundations for the new station buildings. The wind screamed, and the world dissolved into a featureless, blinding white void. A young construction man, operating a bulldozer, lost his bearings instantly. The machine's tracks began spinning uselessly as it crept toward a massive, hidden crevasse. This was a deep, blue-black scar waiting in the treacherous ice shelf. Tassoni relied purely on instinct and the faint, low rumble of the engine. Grabbing a lifeline, he began to crawl toward the sound. the frigid air burning deep in his lungs. He could hear the operator shouting, a thin, desperate sound immediately swallowed by the violence of the wind. When he finally reached the machine, the nose of the massive bulldozer was already hanging over the lip of the fissure. The hot exhaust fumes simply disappeared into the deep blue-black void below. Tassoni didn't bother to signal or shout across the gale. Instead, he simply hauled his body onto the back of the machine. He signaled the terrified operator to drop the heavy blade, then braced himself against the unrelenting wind. Using a frozen winch cable, he anchored the struggling dozer to a pre-placed deadman anchor they had wisely buried in the compressed snow days before. This was a brutal battle against inertia and gravity, conducted in a world where sight was useless and sound was hopelessly distorted by the gale. The massive machine groaned under the strain, the cable snapped taut, and then, slowly, painstakingly, the bulldozer was hauled back from the lethal edge. This single act captured the entire CB ethos applied to the unimaginable extreme. They saved a life and a priceless machine, not from a bomb crater, but from an act of nature so profound it felt like the Earth itself was actively trying to swallow them whole. Construction continued throughout the relentless Antarctic night. By 1962, a full nuclear reactor, constructed and installed entirely by the Seabees, began providing reliable power at McMurdo Station. This incredible feat, born directly from the perilous creation of an airstrip on the shifting ice, it was this engineering achievement that finally opened the frozen continent for sustained, long-term scientific study. The Seabees had definitively proven that their ability to build was not confined by climate or by conflict. From the grueling green nightmare of tropical mud to the frozen tundra where the thermometer plunged past the limits of human endurance, their ingenuity persisted without fail. Their legacy was not just in the thousands of miles of roads laid or the thousands of planes launched from their runways. It resided in the spirit that allowed them to fashion a plow from wrecked tank armor, a makeshift muffler from a bazooka tube, or a stable base on a perpetually shifting ice shelf. They had evolved from middle-aged civilian wartime recruits into young, trained professionals, yet their core identity remained absolutely intact. These were the men who, in the post-war world, continued to anchor pontoon causeways in the desperate tides of Incheon in 1950. They carved massive air bases out of the dense tropical rainforest of Segi Point, moving more earth than was excavated for the entire Panama Canal. They were the critical link between strategy and brutal reality. They were the ultimate proof that engineering was, and always would be, a core component of military success and global projection. Their work fundamentally altered how the Navy operated worldwide, leaving behind a motto that was less a boast and more a simple, etched statement of fact. This motto was placed on every construction site, every temporary base, and every permanent installation they left behind. Quote, "The difficult we do immediately." Unquote. Quote, "The impossible takes a little longer." Unquote. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.